Welcome everyone. It's 12:15 and we're about to start. My name is Carolina Kaufman. I'm so happy to be here and introduce to you an amazing panel of guests that we have today to talk about and in celebration of the 100th anniversary of the women's right to vote, the 19th Amendment. This is the Old Capitol Roundtable, and in lieu of not being able to be open to the public in our museums at the Pentacrest, we want to provide other experiences that allow you to get a glimpse. And this recent slideshow that my assistant, Jillian Schrader, has put on for you includes a lot of images and objects that we have in our exhibit called Hard Won, Not Done, A Century Struggle. Okay, welcome everyone. Again, my name is Carolina Kaufman, and I am here with Jillian Schrader. Say hello, everyone. And we are here to introduce you to an amazing panel today. As I mentioned, this is in commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the women's right to vote. Great, and that's, yep, thank you, Jillian. Yep, so this is us. I am the Director of Education Engagement here at the Pentacrest Museum, and Jillian, who is a student here in her senior year, is my education assistant. She actually helped design this program with me. Thank you, Jillian. And again, we are inspired in this program through our exhibit called Hard Won, Not Done. We have been incredibly grateful to all the supporters in this exhibit and sponsors, including some loans from the Herbert Hoover Presidential Museum. In fact, we have an original assignment that was given to Herbert Hoover's wife, Lou Henry Hoover. She was assigned to write an essay on the topic of suffrage, and we have the original essay. So that's one thing that you'll actually be able to see virtually. We're going to be showing you later how you can actually tour through the exhibit, as in our a Google Street View kind of thing, but interior view of our exhibit. So that's going to be exciting to share later. And many thanks to everyone who supported this exhibit. And now I want to allow the presenters to introduce themselves. We have 4 amazing panelists coming from different parts of the country, and all in similar fields of social justice, community development, political science, and you name it. It's going to be great. So I'm going to allow the panelists to introduce themselves. I'm going to welcome Alexia. Hi, Alexia. Welcome, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yes. Hi, everyone. So great to be here. Thank you for having me. My name's Alexia Sanchez. I just graduated from the University of Iowa, what feels like 100 years ago, but was actually 7 months ago. So I studied political science and social justice with minors in philosophy and Latinx studies. So I was a little busy during my undergrad, and I loved every minute of it. I'm currently in DC right now. I am a Running Start Fellow, and I'm interning for Senator Catherine Cortez Masto.
Great, thank you, Alexia. Linda, welcome, and please introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to this roundtable today. I'm excited about the conversation. My name is Linda Stewart-Crone, and I serve as Director of the Women's Resource and Action Center here at the University of Iowa. And I also hold an interim instructor appointment in the Department of Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies here at the university. I'm delighted to be here in such great company, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Linda. We want to welcome Keshia. Hi, Keshia.
Hello, everyone. I will echo what everyone said. It's such a pleasure to be here having this conversation and being part of this panel with these wonderful women, but everyone else that's also watching as well. My name is Keshia Harrington. I'm an Iowa native. I went to the University of Iowa as well. I graduated a very long time ago. So long that my oldest daughter also graduated from the University of Iowa. I currently serve on the North Liberty City Council, just finishing up a complete year of fully being elected as a counselor. And I'm also a program supervisor for special and underserved populations with the city of Iowa City. I've been in the Iowa City area for a very long time and have been very active in our community with youth and family services for a while. Thanks for having me here too.
We're so glad you're here. You're so important to our community and the communities you serve. Thank you so much for everything you do. And hi, Tracy, welcome.
Hi, again, thanks for having me here too. My name is Tracy Osborne. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Political Science, and I'm also a senior fellow over at the Iowa Public Policy Center. And I focus on women in politics, especially differences among women in politics, women who are elected to office. So it's nice to be here.
Yes, thank you, Tracy. And Tracy, by the way, is well known for her publications and writing. In fact, you have written a book. Jillian, if you could go to the next slide. These are just a few of the publications that she's done, many journal articles as well. So we're so glad that we have somebody who is researching and has this experience. So we're excited about having you on the panel. Let's begin. I just want to remind the audience this is being recorded, and because we are discussing everything from rights and intersectionality, which is important in terms of the women's rights movement, and as Mary Church Terrell often said, we're lifting as we climb, right? We want to make sure that that we maintain a respectful conversation, both from the audience and among panelists. So just a quick reminder, the goals of the museum are to help discover, inspire, and also support in the respect and build responsibility for what we're doing, both through the collections and in our programs like this. In fact, the Capitol Museum is has a great opportunity to serve as a place for civic discourse, and this is a great way to do that. So we find this was the perfect time that we could do this and make both the collection and the exhibits and the meaning behind those exhibits accessible to everyone. Okay, great. So we're going to start right in. My first question to the panel, and again, this is conversational. Looking back at the last 100 years, what were the successes, failures, and shortcomings since the passing of the 19th Amendment? It's been 100 years. What do we have to be reminded of from those past 100 years?
I think I'll just start and say, like, we've had a number of wins, and I would also just to put it in a little box, I guess, I don't think we've won everything. Like, I think we're still in this fight, and it's a continual fight. So we've had wins. Obviously, we're present. We're getting closer to we're represented in the political realm. We're seen a lot more, and that's women across the board, where our voices are being heard. But at the same time, our voices are being silenced when it comes to decisions about our bodies and how we want to live our life and who we choose to love and how we choose to show up and work, and are we able to have a family and still be able to hold a professional job? So I think with all of that, we have definitely made a lot of strides, being from the first woman to vote to now we're out, marching and fighting and standing up in places that we probably wouldn't have before, or we wouldn't have felt empowered to do. So that question is kind of like, wow, when you try to go back, like, I really had to go look and say, what is, historically, where you can count so many wins, but at the same time, you look back and say, well, we still have so much work to do, and we're still fighting for those, because it could be like, yeah, we won in this area, where we here in Johnson County feel like we are empowered to do things, but you look at other places and they're not. So I'm gonna let someone else answer that question, and maybe they have a more, succinct response to that in identifying exactly what it is. But there's so many. There's so many.
I'll go next. I think actually Keshia actually started us off well because she's a woman elected to office, right? So this is sort of a visual of what has really changed in the last 100 years. So I thought I'd say a success, a failure, and a challenge. So I would say, for me, the biggest success, I had trouble thinking of it because I think right now we're all sort of in a headspace of, the sky is falling, when does the asteroid hit? And for me, the success actually came in thinking about, okay, we have a big disease right now, but hey, we know about antibiotics, like we know about vaccines, we've come a long way in our research. And I would actually say the same thing about women and access to voting, access to the economy, things like that, is taking that longer view of 100 years, women have actually achieved a lot more than they would before. So like thinking about 100 years ago, I would never have been able to be a professor. Alexia would never be able to, be on Capitol Hill working, like Keshia would never have been, elected to did North Liberty exist 100 years ago? I don't know. To the city council. Linda we wouldn't have a women's resource and action center, much less a person in charge of it. And so I think that's really the accomplishment. I would say the failure is that, I think a lot of people recognize this, but the 19th Amendment only gave certain women the right to vote. And, that doesn't mean that it doesn't matter. But it does mean that it has to be acknowledged with a grain of salt and spoken of in the same sentence as the Voting Rights Act and the extensions of the Voting Rights Act and civil rights movements of different groups, the Americans with Disabilities Act, all of these things that have made voting more accessible for bigger populations of people. And for me as a political scientist, that's really talking about citizenship. And, the other thing I would add to thinking about citizenship is, when women got the right to vote, when white women got the right to vote in 1920, they still didn't get to sit on juries. They still were barred from holding particular jobs. And so, I think the failure would be to acknowledge the 19th Amendment as an end point, right? Rather, it's really sort of a beginning point. And then the challenge, I would say, this is a bit repetitive, but the challenge I would say is the Voting Rights Act. The challenge for me is thinking that once you achieve something, it always stays. And, I think what we've seen in the last few elections is a lot of groups of people, women who make up a lot of these groups, challenged in their right to exercise the right to vote. And even things like absentee ballot signature matching. Things that sound really boring, but actually are disproportionately affect different communities and our questions right now in our election. And to me, that's the challenge, is how to keep the spirit of these large acts going in those simple, small acts that when you add them all up together mean a lot about how we're able to exercise our right to vote.
That is, both of you have said it eloquently.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I won't try to add a lot, but I will say for me, it's just with a really broad brush, I would say the biggest change in 100 years is that women's lives have moved, to a great extent from a private sphere into the public sphere in ways that our foremothers could not have imagined we would live today. Is it perfect? Is it even? No. There's a lot of work to do to make this equitable, but I think that's the overarching sort of theme that I see.
One quick success that I would add that has impacted my life and our lives is the Metoo movement, which we're all experiencing now and have in years prior. It's such a sensitive topic, but it's so important. And I think bringing, like Linda said, bringing that private conversation that would be, kind of hushed and not talked about, and shedding light on it, shedding awareness, has only impacted us for the better, I would think and would hope. And we have seen the impacts of not only women, but also of men and people of other identities feeling more comfortable, having more freedoms. So I would definitely cite the Metoo movement, and it's an ongoing thing and it's evolving as we're seeing throughout time. So it's definitely very exciting to see.
Yeah, so I'm hearing that that this basically was not a linear path in a way. There were a lot of parallel efforts on many different fronts. So that's really interesting. So much there's so many untold stories as well as I understand from the women's suffrage and even till now. So segueing into my next question, which actually Alexia started talking about a little bit more towards the modern era. What do we think are the biggest modern fights that women are facing right now?
So I can start with this one. I would say two of the biggest ones that come to my mind and I am constantly thinking about are representation in leadership and also the wage gap. So first, representation in leadership, not just in politics, but also in the business sector and nonprofits and in other organizations. Personally, some of the best involvements that I've been in have been run by women, and I don't think that's a coincidence. But there's definitely still a long ways to go. For example, one of the facts and statistics that I just pulled up with a friend of mine is that out of the 535 voting members of both our House and Senate, only 13% are Latinas, which makes up only 2.4, or 13 are Latinas, which makes up 2.4% of the whole demographic. And then when you compare that to how many Latinas are in this country, it doesn't equal and it doesn't match. Additionally, when it comes to wage gap, I just came into this professional world 7 months ago. But every day I'm looking at different job opportunities, job applications, different openings, and the constant idea of how much am I going to get paid? How much do I have to fight to get paid to equal others and to make my work valuable? Tomorrow is actually known as the Latinas Pay Day because we are only paid 67 cents compared to a white non-Hispanic man. So, for example, the difference would imply that that is a loss of almost $25,000. November 29th would be the 22 months that I have to work more compared to a white man to earn that equal amount. So it's definitely frustrating, even in 2020, the fact that I have to go into this mindset and work my way through these new spaces that weren't built for me. And at the end of the day, hoping that not only I'm advocating for myself, but also the employer or whoever I'm working with recognizes that as well.
I will say, like, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna add to what she just said about just the wage gap. The thing is that you went to school, you went to university, and your debt is probably the same as your male counterpart, education-wise. Yet, and still, when you go into the work world, you're likely to get paid a lot less. The good thing about some of this is jobs, well, some career paths are now starting out in tiered pay scales. So we do have a little fighting chance to start out based off of tier pay, but it still does not equate to what we truly deserve and how we often show up a lot, and we're leading those organizations and doing a lot of legwork behind the scenes, and we don't get the equal pay or the recognition for a lot of the things that we tend to juggle as women.
I'm thinking particularly of the impact of COVID and how it is differentiated in its impact on different populations. And certainly as a giant monolith, which is an inapt description of women, it's impacting us differently, but it's particularly impacting women of color. It's particularly impacting women with disabilities. It's particularly impacting immigrant women, documented and undocumented. And I think it's a really critical time for us to pay attention to both the differences between genders and also the differences within gender categories. And to think differently even about the categories. Trans women are often forgotten in these discussions. Non-binary folks are often forgotten. And I think intersectionality is in the title of today's session. And I think it's got to be front and center for us in the equity work that continues.
Yeah, I mean, just like everyone else, I definitely think those problems are important. I would go back to the other problem Alexia highlighted, which is women's representation, because I think it's the antecedent to solving a lot of the other problems. Getting more women into office, getting a diversity of women into office, and honestly fixing the political system in a way that makes it more encouraging and a more positive place for women. So, you know, Alexia mentioned Latinas and their low representation in the House. I think one of the most interesting things is if you look at Black politicians, women of African-American women are actually overrepresented relative to women of other races and ethnicities in the number that are elected in state legislature. So they've actually made more strides. And so we could learn a lot from understanding why they're a higher share of women's, still not 50%, but a higher share of women's seats than for white women or Latinas or other women of color. You know, but there's other things like having to raise a lot of money and, you know, other aspects of politics that deter women from running, and that, you know, even if women are inspired and have lots of good policy ideas and the same kind of education and, you know, the things that we would say qualify them to be great politicians, they're often, I mean, Alexia knows this because she's working for Running Start, but they're often turned off by aspects of current politics, by the polarization, by, you know, having to raise money, by the way, you know, kind of the nasty character of discourse. And I would love to see those things change, because I think that is a political system that was initially structured by white men who held a lot of power, right? And so having sort of a different character of the political system would facilitate seeing more women and seeing women gain more power within that political system.
That's very interesting, Tracy. Actually, it brings me to think about, and we only have about one more minute, but would you be able to tell us in about a minute, what does that representation look like at a global scale, and where do we fit in America on that scale in terms of representation in office?
Yes, sure. The U.S. typically ranks between 80th and 100th in the number of women in its kind of lower house of parliament, which would be our House of Representatives, compared to other countries around the world. A big part of that is that we don't have any kind of system that forces parties and political systems to recruit women or people of different races and ethnicities into their legislature. So, for instance, we required that Iraq have 25% women in their parliament. We don't actually even have that in Congress. So, like, we are demanding things of other countries that we don't have. And so, yeah, we're not good. That's a summary. We're not good. Some states are a lot better, though. States really are where women make a lot of advances in a lot of cases.
That's very interesting, and I had no idea that we ranked that far down. Interesting. That brings us to our third question to discuss in terms of what will this fight look like 100 years from now in the future. Do we see what, you know, are we optimistic? Are we pessimistic? Do you have hope, and why? And also thinking about what needs, which you started discussing a little bit, what are the needs that to change the women's movement to change equity, and what kind of new approaches need to be considered?
I can share first. So am I optimistic? Absolutely. I think we would be doing a disservice to the people before us if we gave up, and threw in the towel, which we can definitely have those moments. And I know I still do, and I will in the future, but remaining hopeful and remaining true to ourselves to continue to stay challenged in this movement. More and more people are stepping up. Even this past week, with everything happening in the Supreme Court, I had 2 of my friends reach out and let me know that they're changing their career to look more into law and look into that sphere and politics, because they have been so inspired and they don't want to sit on the sidelines and feel like they haven't done enough. So if that is their way of going about it, then definitely encouraging them. But it's definitely incredibly inspiring to see that people are taking action and figuring out what fuels their fire and how they can turn that into action, whether that is volunteering, changing their profession, or even speaking out to their networks. One thing that I would say needs to change in the women's movement, I think it's very important to know when to have the mic and when to share that mic, when to step up and when to step aside. I think being a woman doesn't automatically discount you from being harmful to the movement itself. There's so many different approaches to it, so many different identities within the women's movement. I know as a Latina, I could do something that can harm the Black community or the LGBTQ community. And so being aware that we're not perfect within our own approaches and our own philosophies is a way to maybe think about it and evolve within this movement as well. And making sure that we're finding that harmony, maybe right now is not my time to step up and take that mic. Maybe someone else needs it at the moment. That's something that I've seen from the people that inspire me in these spaces and my mentors themselves. And one new approach, I don't know if it's new or if it would be a recycled one, but I think that men need to be in this fight with us. Yes, we can do it by ourselves, but we shouldn't have to. A lot of these issues were created by them. We're not going to ask them to fix it, but they should be with us to work on making it better, because not only do we benefit, they also benefit too. We all benefit. There's so many studies that show that organizations are more successful with women in leadership and when they're more comfortable. Businesses make more profits when there's women in leadership. And I can go on about that, but our issues are their issues too.
I have to say that I get to work with lots of students in my job, and it is the continual source of my optimism to work with younger folks, young women, folks like Alexia, and so many others. And I'm also really, really inspired by some of the current social justice action and work going on in our country and around the world. I've been particularly inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement and by the movement for migrants in our country. And I think those of us, and I'll count myself in this company, who've been around the women's movement maybe a little longer and who look like me, need to pass the mic. And we need to sister our sisters. We need to make sure that we're amplifying other voices. Voices like mine have had a lot of space in the movement. It's time to make room.
I think that what I would have to say about this looking into the future is a little bit different. I'm hesitant to talk about a women's movement. I think there's multiple women's movements, and they don't all agree on what's best for women. And I think there are some legitimate questions about whether the right policies for women, because women are so different, right? There's a lot of heterogeneity in that group. And so, you know, I actually kind of invite discussion about policy choices. So I use an example in my book about debating like what's best for regulating daycare. Should you allow home arrangements of daycare, or should you have heavy regulation? And there's actually lots of good arguments about on both sides. And I'm not saying everybody's opinion is right, you know, or that kind of argument, but I'm saying that, you know, the future is going to bring more heterogeneity in those opinions. And I think that might actually be a good thing, because ultimately in the future it might solve some pressing policy problems that affect women, like the wage gap, you know, things like that. And added to that, you know, our racial and ethnic minority populations are growing at a huge rate. And so in 100 years, the community of women is going to look very different than it does right now. And I think that also might change what the problems are that women face, but also who gets to do the solving of the problems. So those are the two things I would highlight.
And I would say for me, am I optimistic? Absolutely. I am optimistic about what the future entails. I think right now we have a great momentum going of people wanting to be leaders and seeing the potential and possibility of what, you know, no longer being on the sideline looks like, but being at the table, being at the forefront, being a part of the movement or leading that movement. And like you said, Tracy, that looks different. It comes in different ways, and it's not like a one size fits all. I also am definitely inspired by our young people because they have so much energy. It's almost like they don't want to wait anymore. It's like when you talk about, well, 30 years ago we did this, and they're challenging you in a way to say, well, look how little we move. Let's shake it up a little bit. It's not going to be comfortable, but we need to rattle a few feathers to get things moving. And I think the energy behind that is only going to, you know, just blow up even bigger, just because of the way technology works. Information is getting shared so much at a more rapid pace. So you have that. And then you all talked about passing the mic and giving people the opportunity. And for so long, women of color have sat on the sidelines. They have been behind the scenes. And when we talked about women's rights, it was, yes, women in general, but it was just as white women, really, because women of color still had to jump through a whole bunch of other hurdles, and they still do to this day. And so making sure that we look at that and acknowledge that, like, and not to be so intimidated with that power and that of how women of color have to show up, right? I will never forget working, and a white woman said, I wish I had, you know, that confidence. But at first she was afraid of one of our coworkers because of how she spoke up about things that bothered her or things that was unfairly done to her as a woman and as a woman of color. And it was almost looked at as too abrasive. And it was like, if you don't speak up on things that's important to you, people will continue to walk over you and it won't change. So even in your little circles, you still have the power, and you can be so, you can change so many things by speaking up and showing up. And knowing when to just be quiet and knowing when to speak up is very important, because you don't want to do harm or damage to a situation, but you want to be able to navigate and get people to join forces with you to make whatever change that is. And I think that collectively all of us can do it, because we share a lot of the same things, but we also in our own little worlds have our own challenges that we also come up against as women, as females, as feminists, as politicians, as whatever, you know, titles you or labels you carry with you. You come with that, and we have to be able to acknowledge that.
I thought about one more thing, and I would love all the other panelists to share their thoughts on this too. But one thing that I would like to see change in the future would be that we should allow women in leadership and in this movement more grace. I think that when women are in leadership, they're held up to such a high standard of perfection that any minor mistake, and they're cut off, right? And we see that more with women of color and women of different identities. But then when you compare it to maybe men in office, men in leadership roles, they make a mistake and they're forgiven, given the benefit of the doubt, and we move on. But you don't see that as much. You don't see that forgiveness. You don't see that grace towards women. Me, as I'm rising up in these professional spheres, I would love to see that be shed, because I've seen that stop women from running for office, from taking that leadership role or applying themselves to different professions. So that would be one final note for me.
That goes to amplifying women's voices, and for our male allies to help, amplify us, because as women, we're always behind our men, like, hooray, go, you can do this. But where's that same energy when it comes to us, when if we hear our daughters say, I want to be the president of the United States? Will you say, yes, you can do that? Or was that something that you just said to a boy, or, something like that? So we need to have that same energy, and we need to, I don't want to say demand, but at some point it is demand that we get that same level of support and respect, that and grace, as you put it, that men do all the time for their mistakes or carelessness, I should say.
Wow, I'm just so inspired. Such thoughtful responses, and thinking about, how we both see ourselves, how we identify with equal rights, and we live it. We hope for it in the future, especially if we do have children, or we think about the next generation, what that's going to look like. And I'm just glad we have that representation here. I'm going to invite the public here, the audience, to ask any questions that they would like to have from our panelists, and to continue the conversation. But before we do, like, make sure to stick around at the end. We're going to show the exhibit that we have virtually. But let's get right into the conversation. Please, if you have any questions, you could throw it up in the chat, or you can raise your hand. And if you want to raise your hand, you could go to the participant section of your Zoom at the bottom, and you can raise your hand, and Jillian will help assist you on that. So Jillian's paying attention to the Q&A chat area, or hand risen. We can unmute you too if we need to. We'll just double check our, you can actually unmute yourself too, just introduce yourself and share your question.
I'd love to start out with a question. I would just like to know who everyone's like greatest female inspirations are, and like what inspired them to get into leadership positions in the first place.
I'll start. One of the people I love the most was actually in the slideshow, and that's Wells Barnett. So I don't know if you know anything about her, but she was the one who was pictured with her 4 kids, which I'd never actually seen that picture before. But she's a journalist, and she's an African-American woman, and I just love that she did what Homer Plessy did on the train. So if you think about like the case of Plessy versus Ferguson that went to the Supreme Court, thank you, that she actually pushed segregated trains first. And and never gets credit for it. And so I always, when I teach this, think of her. But she's one of my favorite people because I feel like she did a lot of things first and got no credit for it. And just that, she was around the women's suffrage movement for a long time, and was one of kind of the older generation of early suffragists. And yeah, I just really, I like her. You should read about her. I just think she's great.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Someone has kindly, Christian, thank you for putting that Wikipedia in there. This is great. We love the idea of people sharing out.
I think I'll just quickly say a couple of writers whose work really inspired me are Audre Lorde and Gloria Anzaldúa, and a real person I actually got to meet beyond the page is Rusty Barcelo, who was a former administrator here at the University of Iowa and went on to an illustrious career at the University of Minnesota and then in New Mexico and is now retired. But she was one of the founders of the Latino Native American Cultural Center here. And she came to campus from California, had never been to Iowa, found herself in a place where she felt alone, and she built community and built a legacy that lasts. And that inspires me.
For me, I'm gonna be honest and say my grandmother and my mother are my greatest inspiration, honestly. But aside from that, because everybody don't know my mother and grandmother, but they are the most loving and caring people ever. And I know people say that all the time about their parents, probably. But truthfully, Michelle Obama, like, she inspires me. She is one of the most authentic people. And the fact that she was, the president, she's the president's wife, and she carried herself, she held herself up with class. She took a lot of, stones thrown at her because she was different. She wasn't what was considered your traditional first lady. And she took it with stride. And after it all, she was able to keep it real and authentic with us about what that was and how, society tried to change who she was and how she was going to raise her kids and all of it. And she didn't. She still wore the clothes that she thought was stylish to her. She stayed true to herself, and she represented women of color, class. She represented everything we experience on a day-to-day, but she did it in the public eye. And for that, I admire her so much. I admire her as a wife, as a mother, as a public figure, as a leader, and for her truth and honesty, saying that this wasn't the path that I may have, designed for myself, but what am I going to use having the spotlight on me? And she's done such amazing work, and she's my inspiration, honestly.
Yeah, I totally second that. She's my inspiration. One that I would add quickly would be Dolores Huerta. She was one of the founders for the United Farm Workers, and not well known, actually. I didn't know about her until I went to college, which was super disappointing because I spent so much of my life not knowing about her, and because of her, there has been such a movement within US history. If you probably know Cesar Chavez, and maybe was brought up in your history courses or any course like that, but it was not as often that you would hear about Dolores's name, and she was equally as powerful as he was, but definitely the gender issue is what impacted how often her name would be brought up. To this day, she's still active. She's still an activist within her communities and is actually everywhere. I believe she's 90 years old now, and she continues to get arrested because she is so active in what she does in the protests and everything. So very inspiring. I got to meet her last year at an event in Des Moines, Iowa, and I was starstruck. yeah, I definitely encourage everyone to look her up. She has a documentary out as well. And it's always good to freshen up our history when it comes to women.
So we have a couple questions in the chat. The first one is from Teresa, and she asked if some of you or all of you could speak to the disenfranchisement of Iowans convicted of felonies, how that's affecting women, and how we can fight to correct that.
Can you repeat that question, please?
Yeah, sorry. Teresa in the chat asked if we could speak on the disenfranchisement of women of Iowans convicted of felonies and how that might play into this women's rights movement and how we can fight to correct it.
You know, I'm happy to start by talking about this just with some reference to other states. Until just this summer, you know, Iowa was one of the only 2 states that didn't allow anybody convicted of a felony ever to vote again in their lives. And it's changing a little bit, you know, and I actually think that, you know, listening to what Kim Reynolds said about it, her perspective on it was sort of interesting, given her background. I don't know if you want to look into this, but I actually found what she had to say about it was kind of interesting. But I would say the way that this affects women really is more through the men in their lives than them directly, although it definitely does affect a lot of women directly and disproportionately women of color. But there are so many incarcerated men of color so disproportionately, and Iowa was actually one of the most disproportionate states relative to population, that, you know, that really affects the structure of families, right, and things like that. And so it really, even if it's not you that's in jail, right, and that was convicted of a felony and lost your right to vote, it can still affect your family life. And so, I don't know, to me, that's actually how it matters the most. But I think the idea of being able to bring people back into society after a felony and have them participate, if you don't let them vote, I mean, that's kind of the ultimate participation. And so it seems like you're basically saying, like, you're not a citizen for the rest of your life, which would sort of inspire people not to want to get better, right? I mean, so it just doesn't make any sense to me that you wouldn't create some way to restore voting rights. That's all I have to say about it.
I would just add that I think that any attack on anyone's right to vote is an attack on women's right to vote, and vice versa. We all have a stake in one another's ability to participate fully in our country and in decision making, and to bring as many different kinds of voices to those decision making tables as possible. So I don't see one as separate from another. Where there are violations of the Voting Rights Act going on, or where there's disenfranchisement of people who have re-entered society from prison or from prior convictions, it's all of a piece. And I think, you know, the country has struggled from its origins to live up to the ideals that we espouse. And I think the right to vote is fundamental to participating in making decisions in our country, and we all need to safeguard each other's right to vote.
I totally agree with what you all have said. I think disenfranchising people and taking away their vote, it takes away their voice. And, you know, felons, people incarcerated, I honestly feel that they should still be able to vote. Like, yes, you may have committed a crime, but that doesn't mean that you're not a human, or you don't have loved ones that's still out, you know, in the free world, and you still get to make decisions and choices. So I think that voice should be there, and we definitely need to make better strides in allowing for people to still have the ability to vote for things that matter.
One thing I would add as well, aside from the right to vote, would also be the different government assistant programs that maybe they don't qualify for anymore because of that tag on their profile and on their record. Also in terms of the workforce and what opportunities are there for them and which ones are no longer there for them. It makes it more challenging for them to get back up on their feet, to start that life afterwards. And I think it's important to question, you know, which ones are continuing to perpetuate a harmful system that limit those individuals, but also have an echo effect into the whole community. If a woman can't get a job because of that conviction or that past record, how is that going to impact her family, immediate family, also her community and their future? It's all interconnected. It's very interesting. One of the jobs that I had in the past, one of my coworkers, she was very open about having, not very open, but she shared with us of her past record, and she was one of the hardest working people I knew. And I always wondered, you know, how hard was it for her to get this position, and how much harder did she have to work to even be here today? So
Thank you guys so much for answering that question. We have another question in the chat from Marge, and she was wondering what you guys think the next step to get equal rights for women in Iowa is.
I'll take a swing at it. There are many steps necessary. Certainly, and I want to acknowledge that I voted early this year, and it was heartening to see so many women's names on the ballot. That's a huge change. That it hasn't always been like that. They were, however, to my knowledge, all white women. So I think intersectionality is always at the forefront for me. But one of the ways I think that women still need to advance in our state in particular is economically. Economic opportunity, raising wages for women, closing those wage gaps, and closing the opportunity gaps that exist is essential for women to fully be able to realize their potential and take our place in as full citizens and full Iowans. We have to address the economic inequality.
I agree. I think economic inequality is a huge part of it. The other thing I would add is that I think there are some ways in which it makes sense for the law to actually treat women differently from men. So for instance, I think women should have a year off after they have a child, right? And we should have a very clear leave program that's better than the FMLA, that looks more like a European model, because that does so much for community and family. It's not just for the women themselves. And that doesn't mean that there isn't also father time off, right? But it does mean that giving birth to a child from that the woman doing it is kind of a different thing than the dad, or whatever your relationship, it could also be, two women or two men, or, different genders. But in general, right, what I would say is there's actually some things I would like to see that could be done to actually help women create that economic inequality, or fix that economic inequality. And in some ways that might involve actually treating women differently from men under the law.
I think we need both representation and substance to come together especially when we have women in leadership roles, and when we're making decisions about women's rights in general. I think sometimes it can get lost in what's okay for us to make a decision on and what's not, and I don't think that's okay. But also when we have like women in those leadership roles, I think providing the tools to keep them there and not just having a space to say, hey, we have this woman here and that's it. Like, are you actually listening to her and letting her lead in a way that her position is set for her to do? So I do think it needs just the representation and the substance to go hand in a little bit more would be amazing and awesome.
All right, and so we have, I think, one more question before we need to say goodbye. Leah Peterson in the chat asked if you could give one piece of advice to your younger self or to the younger generation, what would it be?
I'm going to quote Alice Walker. The most common way people give up their power is thinking they don't have any. Claim your power, use it.
One that I would share with my younger self or anyone younger than me would be to find mentors. And with that, they don't always necessarily have to share your identities. Some of the best mentors that I have are the complete opposite of me. But what makes that relationship so powerful is that they have an invested interest in seeing me successful, and the other way around, you know. Yes, I have mentors that look like me, share my identities, which is incredible and I'm so grateful for. But I also have mentors that are 6 foot, they're white, they're male, different backgrounds, and they want to see me successful, which is what matters at the end of the day. And I benefit from both types of relationships in various ways. So definitely seeking out those connections and those mentorship opportunities.
I think for me, I would definitely explore like things outside of just what was in front of me. I think sometimes that we can limit ourselves in just what we know because it's not the norm in our culture or what seems to be accepted. And so I would definitely encourage my younger self to explore a little further and to never like view my challenges as a disadvantage, but look at how some of those challenges would help me to evolve into a stronger person, a wiser person, a more forgiving and loving person of not only myself, but of others. And so I think just that, and really believe that, you know, anything is possible. Like you dream it and it could happen, but you also have to be open to allowing people to help you get to that path that you're on, and that you can't do anything just solo by yourself. Like you need other people, and they should be diverse. We all shouldn't have the same thoughts or, you know, just be from the same area. We need to be able to evolve that way. So that is what I would tell my younger self.
I think I would tell my younger self about imposter syndrome. You know, so this is the phenomenon where women and people of color, I think, feel that they don't belong in a particular spot, often because they haven't been part of that hierarchy before. And I suffer from imposter syndrome a lot. And so I would often keep my mouth shut or, you know, not say something I wanted to say, thinking, well, it has to be perfect before I say it, you know. And one of my friends coined the phrase inner mediocre white dude. and that you could name him, and I'm not trying to pick on him, but that you could name him and say, you know, what would mediocre white dude do in this situation? And it kind of, you know, to tell yourself, like, just put it out there, right? You would put it out there because you would feel more comfortable in this situation and maybe not feel the same imposter syndrome. And I think, you know, that's kind of simplifying it. You know, everyone feels imposter syndrome at some point in their life. But I do wish I had gotten over myself a little earlier on. So, and acknowledge that everyone feels that way, and you just have to kind of get over it and accept that you make mistakes and put it out there anyway.
Those are such great advice. Love the quotes, love your personal stories. I want to thank you so much for the time you've given us. Do stick around for just a minute or two. Jillian is going to put up some information, and we're also going to provide some links to different resources that some of the panelists have provided for me that we can offer. And also, if you want to stick around for a couple minutes, for those panelists that are available, we'll just stay for a little bit after the session's finished for any, you know, hard-pressing questions that you'd like to ask, or to the museum staff in relation to the exhibit, the event. Jillian is going to now share the newsletter that we have, which anybody can join, and it gives us up-to-date information. But what I really want to point out from the newsletter, which you can sign up, is that that's where you can find our virtual exhibit for Hard Won Not Done, Century Struggle. And we have some other things happening as well that you can look at. But we're going to quickly just go to this site so that people know where they can get to. There's the Hard Won Not Done logo, and then it goes straight to our virtual walkthrough of the exhibit, which is awesome. So what you could do is you sort of walk these halls here in the old capital of Iowa City, and you can click on these hotspots that give you information about the exhibit. And about that, maybe that particular image. We also have some, for example, the essay by Lou Henry Hoover is there. A couple of artifacts that were on loan from us from various institutions. And so please go ahead and explore that. We'll put the link to the newsletter on the chat so you can access that. If we could go back, we would like to share just real quickly that our students who are vital to the museum also created a podcast called Museum Weird, all things about museums, but it's through the perspective of our docent managers who are both students here at the University of Iowa. So you can tune into that. A lot of fun listening in, and they'll do several episodes. Jillian, why don't you take me back to our slideshow with our contact information and resources that anyone on the session can link to. We will provide a recording of the session on our website as well. So stay tuned for that. You could tell anybody that you know that couldn't make it today that they can see that. Yes, here's some, the big theme here I think today is stepping up, right? And so these are all the different resources based from both our panels, the Women's Resource Action Center, League of Women Voters, who were really important in both this exhibit and their own 100th anniversary celebration since 1920 here in Iowa. And of course, the League of United Latin American Citizens, which Alexia was a president of, the youngest president of, and the Department of Political Science. If you want to reach out to Tracy about anything related to political science here or her work, there's a link there. And of course, our museum website. Thank you so much. If we could go one more slide, we're so happy that you could make it. And we're looking forward to hosting other events soon. Be on the lookout, again, through the newsletter. That's the best way to find out. But if you want to email us directly or contact us, we're happy to do that for you. And lastly, I just say if you could please share your feedback about this session, we would greatly appreciate it. It informs us about our future programs and bringing in amazing guest speakers like we've had today. Let's all give a round of applause to our speakers. If you can, there's a little reaction button down in the corner of your Zoom. Go ahead and put a clap or show a clap to everyone. And again, if you have any questions either about the exhibit, about what we've talked about today, about our resources, both my staff at the museum here are here available for you, and for those panelists that can stay a few minutes, we'll be here. We'll be ending the recording now.